Welcome back to the No Nonsense Sustainability Podcast. I'm Ildiko Simsik, and today we're talking about economics and inequality. My guest today is Stuart Trow, a columnist for Bloomberg and the Washington Post, with a long career in economics, market, financial advice. He was a senior market strategist at EBRD and held senior positions in the National Australia Bank. We're talking about his latest book, Young, Poor, and Totally Screwed, that talks to my generation, the millennials. Welcome to the show, Stuart.
Thank you.
So in the book, you talk about being a boomer yourself.
Yeah.
What was that moment of self-reflection that made you think that maybe those avocado toasts and matcha lattes were not the reason why my generation cannot buy houses?
Right. Well, it was several things over my career, but there was one particular episode, if you like. I used to work for a Japanese bank, and Japan, when I was at university and shortly afterwards had an asset bubble to beat all asset bubbles, and younger workers there, often had quite strong career aspirations, but they could never aspire to owning property because they had a housing boom which dwarfed anything we've seen in Europe. But what it meant was that no matter how well they did in their careers, they were never able to aspire to asset ownership. So they expressed that by being more consumer oriented. So if you've got the disposable income, you can consume your avocado toast, which is, to be fair, quite a modest aspiration, but you could never aspire to owning assets and building wealth. And you're seeing a similar story play out for the generations that followed the baby boomers.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about intergenerational equity and inequalities. In the show, we have the buzzer when we slip into the buzzwords or the jargon. And if I gave you 60 seconds to explain what intergenerational equity is without using a buzzword, how would you go about it?
Well, I suppose it's understanding what creates intergenerational disadvantage, which then feeds through to the inappropriate use of the planet's resources for boosting wealth for certain generations, but not for others. So, one of the things, for example, that created the good quality jobs when I first started making my way in the world, if you like, and bearing in mind, we also thought things were tougher for us, but they've got tougher. I think that's the narrative. But, it was the realization that trade and investment work, and such investment as we've seen hasn't been directed towards improving productivity in the economy to create good jobs for millennials. And to be fair, all the generations that have followed the baby boomers. So recognizing that trade and investment work would be a big start to preserving the planet and its resources for future generations, so we're not misallocating capital along the way. So one of the things I'm intensely conscious of in terms of this intergenerational legacy, if you like, is that China lifted itself out of extreme poverty precisely by inviting trade in on in a very prescribed manner, and also investing, and it lifted close to 1 billion people out of poverty. So that's where I'm coming from. It's the trade and investment that work, that create the good quality jobs, create engagement with things like climate change, so that when it comes to actually exploiting the planet's resources, in a good way rather than a negative way, that they're not too bound up in intergenerational disadvantage to not be bothered about the climate impact of what they're doing.
Yeah, because, the inequalities in society and between these generations is just one aspect. But the other aspect is the climate change.
Yes.
Where everything was set up with a different perspective, that we will have climate stability, we will have cheap energy, and all the policies and the economic incentives were designed with that in mind. And then life changed.
Yes. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, and one of the things that I guess that I found quite frustrating is that I finished the first draft of the book just before the pandemic. Oh. And at that point, we could only speculate about the impact of a major economic setback, how that would affect engagement with climate change and, mitigation efforts and stuff like that. But what COVID made clear was that initially everybody was really excited because there were fewer planes flying around, the skies were clearer, and they thought, oh, well, this...
Dolphins were back in Venice, right? That was the news.
Exactly it. And people were sort of quite excited about that, and it appeared to vindicate the sort of, well, economic progress is perhaps bad for the climate. But what very quickly happened after that was, a lot of countries didn't have the social safety nets that some Western countries had, and climate change engagement just went through the floor. So, we ended up in a situation where, say, India, to take one example, was making huge progress in solar farms. It was nicely placed in terms of climate for large parts of the country to do that. Yet it still granted private licenses for mining, which it hadn't done either ever, or certainly not for a long time. Not because it needed the energy from coal, but that it needed the jobs that had been displaced by the economy collapsing by more than a quarter. And, you had a similar thing in China, where the national government had made big statements about moving towards net zero and beautiful China. But on a local municipality level, they see building and development as vital to maintaining the region's prosperity. So again, you were getting coal-fired power stations being developed because it created jobs and wealth in the short term. And so the economic imperative sort of crowded out climate change mitigation in the sort of, if you like, the finite pool of worry.
But is that just a lag between policy directives trickling down to implementation, or is that really driven by the need for jobs?
I think it's less a lag and more a cause, because it's taken time to feed through. So if you look at say fossil fuel subsidies, both direct and indirect, they've never been higher. And it's the same with fossil fuel consumption. It's never been higher. So and in some senses, they're getting worse in the worst possible way, because coal is very much a feature of the increase in fossil fuel consumption. So I think that kind of indicates that when you create economic hardship, either by external events that you can't control, like COVID, or, tightening monetary policy to make investment more expensive, or austerity and big tax increases and stuff like that. When you slow the economy and give people more immediate concerns than climate change mitigation to deal with, then you're storing up a problem. And that is the transmission mechanism from economic hardship and intergenerational disadvantage to sort of kind of backsliding on climate change.
And so what was the major change between the pre-COVID draft of the book and what was published?
Well, in the pre-COVID draft, there was a study done by an organization called CNA, which is an amalgam of sort of retired diplomats, sort of military politicians, scientists, all the rest of it. And they war gamed scenarios around climate change, things like sort of scarcity of water, resources, stuff like that. And every single time it came back to sort of developed countries pulling in their horns, becoming much more isolationist, much more nationalistic, much more sort of friction and outright sort of hostility and wars around climate escalation, but one of the big impacts will be sort of forced migration, for example. And, you can look at the populist examples you've got now where people are complaining about relatively small migratory flows. Imagine 100 times that when people are fleeing genuinely unstable sort of environmental issues. And all those sort of issues, they were wargaming to speculate about what might happen, whereas COVID actually showed us what does happen. And, we've only got to look at, it's not just individuals being skeptical about things like net zero. It's actually governments acting in that way as well, backsliding on, new airports and sort of, even raising, trade tariffs against electric vehicles and batteries and, and windmills and stuff like that. It's just so much the opposite of what we need to do. And a lot of it is driven by the political and economic imperatives of slower growth.
Yeah. So in a way, we're pushing the problem forward to the next generation.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So if we know through the studies, research, decades of data that this approach doesn't work, why can we do better? And I know one of the arguments everybody says is that it's actually the boomers in the decision-making seats, very few younger people in seats at the right tables where these decisions are actually made. So that's how we recreate this cycle of inequality. But now we have so much more access through social media to voice concerns, to raise awareness, to demand transparency and demand action and accountability. Why are we still making the same mistakes?
Well, I think one of the things we've sort of not taken account of is human behavior. And in my book, I often make the distinction, often state my belief is that often it's human behavior that's the difference between sort of models and reality. And one of the things I think makes it very difficult is that humans have got a really strong attachment to fairness. So younger generations, for example, are intensely aware that they've been disadvantaged to an extent we haven't seen in many generations. But at the same time, sometimes our reactions to perceived unfairness aren't very rational. So, there's an economist, Branko Milanovic. He says basically the losers of globalization have been placated with populism. So it's very easy to misdirect the feelings of unfairness. And why that is important is because if you try and correct prior unfairness, say with redistributive taxes or social policies, stuff like that, you then get some of the advantaged groups protesting against that, saying that's unfair. So a classic example of that was the January 6th insurrections in Washington in 2021. There was an economist called Robert Pape. He did a lot of work on that, and he wanted to understand who exactly it was who was protesting. And what he found was that, they were twice as likely to be business owners as general right-wing extremist sort of protesters. They were probably about 2/3 less likely to be unemployed. So basically these, and obviously white and male, but basically these guys, by any sort of conventional reading, were the winners of the economic situation and way things have progressed, yet they were protesting things being unfair. And what the one thread you could draw through all of them was that they came from non-Trump counties, but counties that were experiencing rapid demographic change. So they were kind of pushing back against what they perceived to be unfair. Whereas, if you sit back and take a more measured view of the whole thing, that's absurd. They very well. But what that underlines is the difficulty in unwinding unfairness and how important it is that economics doesn't embed unfairness in the first place.
But is it possible to create an economic policy that's fair to everyone?
I guess there are always going to be winners and losers, but the most obvious thing is that, at the moment, if the economy slows, the response is to lower interest rates and the slower the economy gets, the lower the interest rates go. So free money. But when you get a situation where the economy is almost flatlining, but asset markets, the stock market, house price and everything like that's going up, it very clearly demonstrates that the only benefit of extreme monetary policy is to make existing asset owners even richer. If you're working a minimum wage job in the gig economy, zero interest rates or zero mortgage rates is of no conceivable benefit. In fact, if anything, it'll move assets even further out of your reach.
Yeah, I guess that's what we have seen.
Yeah.
Because through my work with these development banks during COVID, they had special funds, really easy money to fund projects that were not necessarily like pandemic response. I feel like we would have done it anyway, but they were packaged as a pandemic response, whether that was like hospital renovation or financial intermediary projects supporting businesses so they can maintain their employees like through that economic downturn. But this is not the first economic crisis in my lifetime, right?
No. Yeah.
How is this one differs from like the last one, 2008?
I think it differs in as much that there's far more awareness of the climate issue on more recently. So it's easier to see the extent to which we've stepped back in terms of our climate change engagement. The phrase net zero madness, it's sort of bandied about quite easily. And, when you distort the investment process with policies aimed at reducing, emissions, but do it in a economically dysfunctional way, it's easy to criticize. But the point that gets lost in all of this is that the reason that the criticism is quite so intense is because people are experiencing economic hardship and they feel they have bigger concerns putting food on the table than worrying about climate change decades hence, which, that's not a very helpful narrative, but that's actually what's happening. You can see it in terms of government policies right the way around the world. Trump is perhaps the most extreme manifestation of that, but he's not the only one. Sort of development of Heathrow Airport and taxes on electric vehicles that we, very recently and stuff like that. And the infrastructure for the green transition, if you like, that's attracted some of the highest tariffs in the world, which is just absurd. We need to be investing, and China predominantly can produce the very goods we need, batteries, wind farms, sort of electric vehicles very competitively, and yet we're slapping tariffs on them.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it all trickles down, right? Because through our work with like EBRD, Development Finance Institution, you are funding the renewable projects. You are funding the companies that have these Chinese manufacturers in their supply chain that are actually like implementing the projects that these policies prescribe.
Yeah.
But then how is it that it's more of a development finance and not part of the mainstream finance? Because sustainable finance as such, the argument for that was that we can be green and we can be profitable at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think a large part of it is incentives. You get the incentives right and the money will come, because to an extent, it doesn't matter who's spending or who's investing the money. If government's not necessarily producing the money to invest because they're on a tight fiscal rein, they can nonetheless set the rules of the game, and the private sector sort of plays around those rules. But, it's almost like a game of football. If the referee's not in charge, the game descends into chaos. And that's what we've got at the moment. There's no clear direction from government, whether it's spending taxpayers' money effectively or directing the private sector's investment effectively. None of that's happening.
Is that why net zero is more of an aspiration and not a reality?
I think so. Yeah. Because I mean, one of the issues is that we're even the proponents of net zero are sort of kind of presenting it as a cost that has to be borne. But, if we go back to what I was saying about how China addressed poverty and lifted the living standards of, basically most ordinary Chinese, it was by investing. And, we've got this situation where, we've got the issue of climate change, existential issue for the planet, which requires investment, and jobs for the generations that followed the baby boomers requires investment. Well, it should be a massive opportunity, because I mean, in the past, people have built infrastructure, roads to nowhere in Japan was a classic one when I was younger, but we've got a chance to build meaningful assets to create wealth and good jobs, but also mitigate climate change.
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting to talk about how this whole idea that we can be net zero is also accompanied by an unprecedented awareness of sustainability. Yeah. We have more stringent reporting requirements than ever before. Yeah. We have updated regulation. We're trying to come up with EU taxonomy, global taxonomy. Companies value responsible business conduct, whether that's human rights or environment or combination. Yeah. So how is it that all this goodwill is not leading to a more meaningful change?
Yeah, no, it is. It's difficult and frustrating, but I think again it comes down to it's the economy, stupid. The Bill Clinton thing that if stuff that damages the economy ultimately damages engagement with climate change. So you're not going to achieve meaningful mitigation of climate change by damaging the economy. I think that's what COVID showed very clearly because of the consequences of the slower growth there. But you've also got to recognize that the investment has to be directed efficiently, not just sort of drill, baby drill, or burn, baby burn, or whatever. The government and, more entities such as the EU and stuff like that have got a responsibility to be pragmatic about the climate and about the economy and realistic. So there are a lot of things that you think might work, you think are fair, sort of like redistributive taxation. That sounds fair, but you have to be intensely aware of the incentives it generates within the economy. So, talking about national budgets and stuff like that, if you say raise income tax on people by and large can't avoid that, and most people pay it and what have you. But if you tax more niche groups, they have got more flexibility to, stop hiring, stop investing, and ultimately leave the country. And so when you get into a situation where the focus is more on redistribution rather than investing to create opportunities, you kind of get distracted from what the real mission is here.
No, and that's interesting because at EBRD you worked primarily with like ex-Soviet countries or Eastern Europe that was more sort of like socialist, where there was a more developed system of this redistribution. As someone who grew up in that, when I hear these developed countries talking about the systems that my parents said didn't work, I do have some questions and concerns. So how did your work and involvement in post-Soviet, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, inform or change your perspective on this redistribution and effective ways of redistribution?
Yeah, because I mean, in some ways, I mean, it's sort of tangential to that slightly, is that, a lot of people in the West, policymakers and economists, imagine that, the collapse of the Berlin Wall was, what heralded in an era of low inflation and faster growth. Whereas actually, my argument was that it didn't happen because of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It happened despite Tiananmen Square in China. So that the lesson from that was, it was a autocratic, definitely not very democratic nation that nonetheless created the greatest economic miracle we've ever seen. So no matter how imperfectly it happens, the trade and investment do help alleviate policy and promote development. And I think, development banks can play a role in that, in fostering growth and making sure there's the finance there, because if the finance there isn't there, nothing happens. And that was something we clearly saw after the financial crisis. As culpable as banks were for creating the financial crisis, if they're not there, money doesn't get created in the economy and growth is impossible. You want banks to be lending to improve productivity in the economy. You don't want them lending to foster speculation. And, development banks can have that role because they're very specifically not looking to speculate. They're looking to generate productive assets in the economy.
Yeah. And they also have the flexibility to take on more risks, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I mean, and that to that extent, having more innovative financial products, as long as you understand the consequences of those, can really help, leverage the capital of a development bank. EBRD is relatively small in that sense, but if it can leverage its capital by bringing in other money from sort of more commercial enterprises, and also, by taking a key stake in a project rather than funding the whole thing, it can provide confidence in a project that it's being properly managed and overseen without putting an undue amount of its capital at risk in a single sort of entity.
But ultimately, someone always pays the price, right?
Yes.
So whether it's the government putting in place incentives to go towards a more climate adaptation approach, or to green the economy, to create jobs, or if it's the private sector that sets up a net zero fund, someone is ultimately paying the price.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah, you could put it that way. I mean, but a lot of these things don't have to be that way, but you're exactly right. The way they're portrayed at the moment is there's always somebody, it's those with the broader shoulders have to pay for this, that, and the other. And, if it's not the most effective and efficient spending of the green pound, if you like, you're not getting as much economic benefit from the green transition as you might do.
Yeah. And I guess some of these, more site and project specific sort of like, issues that we face is that you can't have both. You can't have high social impact and high climate change impact, because if you have high climate adaptation, that probably means that there's like less infrastructure built, less jobs for people. Whereas if you have more jobs for people, more infrastructure for people, you score worse on the climate scale.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's difficult. And that's why it's so vital that sort of government plays its role in setting the rules of the game, if you like, to encourage the outcomes it wants, because, there are ways of investing effectively, and what you're trying to avoid is a situation where you're creating regulatory arbitrage. So, for example, sort of tech companies are incentivized to sort of do their offsets in less developed countries, and because there's an arbitrage there. It's not actually helping the planet very much, and it's not actually creating very much wealth outside a small subsector of developed economies. So it's essential that you sort of not only set the rules with that in mind, with the objective in mind, but also you regularly review them, because very often things done with the best of intentions, the outcome is not what you expected, and you have to respond to that. And the economics is particularly bad at doing that, because it doesn't take too much notice of when reality diverges from its models.
Yeah. So I guess like translating it to the like real life of people, like my generation.
Yeah.
no permanent contract, no job security, no pension, limited opportunities to own property and assets and savings and investments. Everyone in the gig economy, freelancing, self-employment. How do we adapt? How do we, is there any part of this system that we can exploit to our benefit?
Well, I think, again, it just comes back to investment, having an investment culture. Because again, this, we've been speaking about this earlier, was that, a test for how effective investment is in the economy is if you've got very low interest rates to foster investment and all you're seeing is rising asset prices, well, it's not working. And at the same time, if you're investing in things that aid productivity in the economy, that's less likely to be inflationary. So if you're investing in a way that people can work more efficiently, say, if people have, a current topic in terms of economic activity in the UK is mental health. So if you have adequate resources for people to get help with their mental health, the stereotypical economist would look at that and say, well, that's actually improving their productivity. You've got more workers out there in a fit state to work. So more economic engagement, and you can direct that towards more green stuff. So they're working sort of not down a coal mine, but perhaps working to sort of, improve our, transmission infrastructure for, the national grid is a classic example of, a lack of investment actually costing us money because we've got the most expensive fuel bills in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. And so in terms of positive takeaways from the book, because we need to end on a high. We've been through a lot, but there's always something to look forward to. So what are some of the positive takeaways from the book and from the current situation for my generation and my daughter's generation?
Yeah, well, I think, we do know what works, trade and investment work, but also in terms of understanding that it's more difficult to fix something after it's gone wrong than it is to make sure you get it right in the first place. And that's where perhaps the younger generation of economists, so speaking to I appreciate not everybody's an economist, but there's so much potential to think outside current sort of economic thinking, looking at what works, looking at what helps you achieve your goals, even if it sounds slightly counterintuitive. And then one of the problems with economics is often they're very siloed. They don't look at influences from outside the field nearly as much as any of the other social sciences. And you might find that the bright young things who win future economics Nobels have done precisely that. They've been influenced by what's happening in other areas. For example, economics was really, really slow and still doesn't particularly get that the idea of cumulative advantage and disadvantage. If you have a fortunate start in life, it doesn't mean revert as most economic models would suggest. It actually gets better and better and better for you. And similarly, if you get off to a bad start, perhaps don't manage to get that you graduate into a recession or something like that, it has a measurable impact right the way through your life. And recognizing that and acting on that, it will give young economists sort of much more relevance than any economist has had for decades, but it will have a material impact on the economy and society in general and give us a fighting chance in terms of tackling climate change.
Well, thank you for being here with me today, Stuart, and discussing intergenerational inequalities. I certainly have some takeaways from this discussion as a member of the millennial generation. I hope you also found this discussion inspiring. Thank you for being here with us today, and we'll be back some more next time.